Hi, and thanks for watching this message video. Today we're continuing on in our series called the Super Cool Stories of the Bible, where we're looking at various stories throughout the Bible and trying to learn various lessons from them. And today we're looking at the story of when the two false gods of the Sidonians, Baal and Asherah, were challenged to a duel, you might say, by Elijah on Mount Carmel. Now, for those of you who may not know, Israel at this time was divided into two kingdoms, with Israel in the north with Samaria as its capital and Judah in the south with Jerusalem as its capital. And King Ahab was the king of Israel. And let's just say that King Ahab was a very bad king. In fact, look at what we're told. 1 Kings 16:29. Ahab, son of Omri, began to rule over Israel in the 38th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. He reigned in Samaria 22 years, but Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. And as though it were not enough to follow the sinful example of Jeroboam, he married Jezebel, the daughter of King Ethbaal of the Sidonians, and he began to bow down in worship of Baal. First, Ahab built a temple and an altar for Baal in Samaria. Then he set up an Asherah pole. He did more to provoke the anger of the Lord, the God of Israel, than any of the other kings of Israel before him. Again, for those who may not know, King Saul was the very first king of Israel, and you know what? He did a terrible job. In fact, he made God very, very angry, and as a result, when he was killed, he had his head cut off and he had his body spiked to a wall. Not exactly an honoring way to die. Then there was King Jeroboam, who led all of Israel into worshiping two golden calves, claiming that they were the ones that led them out of Egypt. And as a result, not only was he killed, his whole entire dynasty were killed, and then their bodies were eaten by either dogs or vultures. Again, not an amazing and honoring way to die. Which brings me to the first lesson in this story, which is, don't make God mad, especially when you're in a leadership position for God. So in other words, if you're a king of something, you are expected to listen to God and obey him. And King Ahab obviously would do neither. And as a result, God sent Elijah to confront him and to deal with him. And what he told him is that he was not going to allow, Elijah told Ahab that he was not going to allow any rain or dew for the foreseeable future as a punishment. And then he turned and he walked away. And then for a very long time, God supernaturally took care of Elijah while everybody else, including King Ahab, suffered from this drought. And while he continued to look, King Ahab continued to look for Elijah, he couldn't find him anywhere. God kept hiding him. And then this happened. 1 Kings 18. Later on, in the third year of the drought, the Lord said to Elijah, "Go and present yourself to King Ahab. Tell him that I will soon send rain." So Elijah went to appear before Ahab. Meanwhile, the famine had become very severe in Samaria. When Ahab saw him, he exclaimed, "So, is it really you, you troublemaker of Israel?" "I have made no trouble for Israel," Elijah replied. "You and your family are the troublemakers, for you have refused to obey the commands of the Lord and have worshipped the images of Baal instead. Now summon all Israel to join me at Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who are supported by Jezebel." So Ahab summoned all the people of Israel and the prophets to Mount Carmel. I want to stop here and ask everyone to consider this question for a second. If King Ahab really did indeed make God more angry with him than any of the other kings before him, then why did he wait 3 years before bringing the spanking? Why did he wait 3 years before bringing any kind of real discipline into his life specifically? I mean, think about it. That's an awfully long time to wait before bringing down the discipline of any kind, really. Which brings us to the next lesson in this story, which is God is patient, even with those who make him the most angry. But there will come a day where eventually God will deal with and confront those who are making him angry or disobeying him. And that day had come for every single one of the prophets of both Baal and Asherah, who were leading the people astray. And so this is what happened next. 1 Kings 18:21. Then Elijah stood in front of them and said, "How much longer will you waver, hobbling between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him." But the people were completely silent. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only prophet of the Lord who is left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Now bring 2 bulls. The prophets of Baal may choose whichever one they wish and cut it into pieces and lay it on the wood of their altar, but without setting fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood on the altar, but not set fire to it. Then call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by setting fire to the wood is the true God. And all the people agreed. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, You go first, for there are many of you. Choose one of the bulls and prepare it and call on the name of your God, but do not set fire to the wood. So they prepared one of the bulls and placed it on the altar. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noontime, shouting, Oh, Baal, answer us! But there was no reply of any kind. Then they danced, hobbling around the altar they had made. About noontime, Elijah began mocking them. You'll have to shout louder, he scoffed, for surely he is a god. Perhaps he is daydreaming, or is relieving himself, or maybe he is away on a trip, or is asleep and needs to be wakened. So they shouted louder, and following their normal custom, they cut themselves with knives and swords until the blood gushed out. They raved all afternoon until the time of the evening sacrifice. But still, there was no sound, no reply, no response. Let's stop here for a second so we can focus on another important lesson in this story, which is this: sometimes sarcasm is appropriate. And clearly in this situation, sarcasm was appropriately used. But let me remind everyone, sarcasm is typically disrespect cloaked in humor or false sincerity, which is exactly what Elijah was doing. So we need to be careful that our sarcasm is genuinely motivated by God and not out of a desire to seem witty to others. So, now that these 850 prophets have had their turn at calling on Baal and Asherah to light their bull on fire, that's funny, yeah, light their bull on fire, no pun intended. Now it was Elijah's turn. 1 Kings 18:30. Then Elijah called to the people, Come over here. They all crowded around him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one to represent each of the tribes of Israel, and he used the stones to rebuild the altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around the altar large enough to hold about 3 gallons. He piled wood on the altar, cut the bull into pieces, and laid the pieces on the wood. Then he said, Fill 4 large jars with water and pour the water over the offering and the wood. After they had done this, he said, Do the same thing again. And when they were finished, he said, Now do it a 3rd time. So they did as he said, and the water ran around the altar and even filled the trench. At the usual time for offering the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet walked up to the altar and prayed, O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. Prove that I have done all this at your command. O Lord, answer me. Answer me so these people will know that you, O Lord, are God and that you have brought them back to yourself. Immediately, the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust. It even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out, The Lord, He is God! Yes, the Lord is God! Then Elijah commanded, Seize all the prophets of Baal. Don't let a single one escape. So the people seized them all, and Elijah took them down to the Kishon Valley and killed them there. All of Israel had been led astray by bad leadership, and as a result, they had forgotten just how powerful God really is, and that He will not tolerate our affection or their affection for any other God. And so you and I can learn from this story that God is always eager to show off and flex when it comes to a contest between Him and some other so-called God. I'm sure many of you remember this, but for those who don't, think of the Egyptians. Literally, with the 10 plagues, this was God showing up and demonstrating for the Egyptians that every single one of their gods, God had the power to dominate it or to rule over it. So, in essence, this leads us to the next lesson that we can learn in this story, which is God wins every fight. And by that I mean, God does not lose. He does not lose a war. He does not lose a battle. He does not lose anything. In fact, look at what it is that we are told about God's intellect and His power, which honestly makes any fight not really a fight. Psalm 147:5. How great is our Lord! His power is absolute. His understanding is beyond comprehension. God's brilliance and his intellect and his power is so far beyond our comprehension that there really is no strategy that anybody could ever use against God. And because he is all-powerful, what that means is that all power exists because of him or through him. So we can count on God. We can know that when it comes to any situation where he needs to put his power on display, particularly in the middle of a fight, it's no fight. God's going to win every time. So what have we learned from this super cool story? Well, hopefully the very first thing that we've learned is don't make God mad, especially when you're in a leadership position. That's the time when you and I should be listening to God and obeying him and leading others toward that very same thing. But even if we're not, and we're like King Ahab, God is patient. Even if we're in a situation where we're making God incredibly angry, he is patient. But know this, if God has warned us and he has told us that we need to change, but yet we persist on doing things not the way that God said or by being disobedient, then as a personal advice to you, let me say, brace yourself for the ass whooping. And I don't mean that sarcastically. Which is something else that we learned in this story, is that there is a time for sarcasm. However, it needs to be motivated by God and not out of a desire to be witty to others. And ultimately, the last thing that we learned in this story is that when it comes to a fight, God wins every time. So why fight his will? What you and I instead should be doing is looking to be somewhat like an Elijah. And if God is confronting us about any of the sinful things in our lives, then yes, put it to death. But ultimately, now we should be going around and helping others by confronting maybe the sinful things that are inside of their lives and helping them to return to a worship of God.